Well, the last handful of chapters of the book of Acts that we've looked at in previous episodes, we've seen this pattern of Paul standing before either a council or a governor or some sort of authority figure, or even to a whole crowd, of a mob of people who, where he gives a defense or a testimony of some sort. And we're going to continue to see that today. The pattern is still going to continue. This time, Paul is going to be speaking before the governor Festus. Oh, goodness. See, I did this last time at the end of last episode where I refer to Festus as Festivus, and I got to stop doing that. Again, if you're familiar with Seinfeld, if you saw that when that was on TV, you know what Festivus is all about. But I got to get my words straight. It's not Festivus, it's Festus. Paul is going to be speaking to Festus, okay? So yeah, you know what? Let's just get started with this whole thing. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. Well, as I mentioned just a few seconds ago, we're going to start to look at Paul as he appears before the governor Festus, okay? See, now I'm going to have to think real hard, just to make sure that I say the name right and make sure I say Festus instead of Festivus. But anyway, I didn't expect to mess up this early in the podcast episode. For that, I apologize. But that's what we're going to do today as we're continuing our study of the book of Acts. We're getting ready to start chapter 25. So, like I said before, we're getting closer to the end of our study of the book of Acts here. As Acts, as you may well know, has 28 chapters. So we're slowly but surely making our way to that point. So we're going to look at chapter 25 today, as much of it as we can. I'm going to see, and we'll see how time permits here, and it'll depend on whether there are certain parts of this episode where I just ramble on, or if I'm just able to go straight through. I'm going to see if we can go through the whole chapter today. Not making any promises or anything like that, but I think maybe there's a possibility that we can look at that we can take care of chapter 25 in one podcast episode, that being this episode. So we will see what we can do as far as that is concerned. So just to catch our bearings here a little bit, in case you're joining Loving the Scriptures and you're hearing this for the first time, obviously then that would mean that you haven't been with us through our study of the book of Acts, which is okay. I try and sum up just kind of where we are as best as I can, so you can pick up where we leave off. And everything. And depending on your understanding of Scripture, your knowledge of Scripture, you might have a knowledge of things that have been going on up to this point. But pretty much we're in that last section there of the book of Acts, the last handful of chapters, the last quarter, chapter-wise, I guess you could say, of the book of Acts, which mostly deals with Paul in captivity. As I've said several episodes ago, pretty much from the time you get from chapter 21, chapter 22 on to the end of the book, what we see is Paul in captivity. We see a man in captivity. Whereas throughout much of the book of Acts prior to that point, you see Paul traveling here and there, talking to these people and that people, just kind of doing the work of a missionary. And having some amazing results, but also at the same time having a great deal of trouble as well in the form of persecution, whether Jews, unbelieving Jews, or Gentiles who are pagans and who are offended by what Paul has to say. But even when you're dealing with a man who is in chains, as we've seen now for the past handful of episodes, in the past handful of chapters of the book of Acts, you see that Paul still doesn't fail to stir up controversy. And that's not because he's doing anything wrong. That's not because he's saying anything wrong. He stirs up controversy because to the unbelieving mind, and in this particular context of everything that we're looking at right now, we're looking at the unbelieving Jewish mind, the unbelieving Jews. In their mind, the truth serves as a controversy. Really, when you have people who think that they live religiously and they think that they're living rightly in the sight of the Lord. And they're confronted with truth that really, in a lot of ways, I would imagine, serves as a bit of conviction. There's two things that can happen. Either one, you can embrace the truth as it's presented, repent, admit that you're a sinner, and turn to Christ for forgiveness of sins, or you can try and block the conviction that the Lord is trying to use on a person's heart, and do everything that you can to squash down the truth and to squash down the person who is delivering that truth. And pretty much that's what we've been seeing for a large portion of what we've been looking at in the book of Acts over the past few chapters. Just to remind you of where we are, Paul is in prison. He's in captivity, and it all goes back to chapter 21, when he's in Jerusalem, when he's at the temple, and you have these Jews who accuse him of speaking against the Jews, speaking against the holy place, and speaking against the law of Moses, which stirs up a big crowd, a mob of a crowd who tries to kill him. And they would have been successful probably had the Roman authorities hadn't come in and interfered with that whole endeavor and rescued him from the crowd. The Romans, particularly the tribune, Claudius Lysias, wants to know what's going on with this guy, so he calls the assembly together to try and find out what's going on there. That ends up being an unsuccessful venture because the Pharisees and the Sadducees within the council end up getting into a fight, literally, both verbally and, you get the sense from the text, physical fight over the whole thing of resurrection. And so the Romans drag Paul out of there because they're afraid that he's going to get ripped up in the middle of the melee there. So nothing gets accomplished there. Claudius Lysias learns, as Paul learns, that there's a plot against Paul's life, under the whole guise of, hey, bring him before the council again so that we can investigate this thing further. The whole idea was that on the way from the barracks to the council, that he would be ambushed and they would kill him. But Claudius Lysias finds out about it, decides to send him to Felix in Caesarea. So he sends him to Caesarea and then says to the council, hey, if you want to continue this whole thing against Paul, you're going to have to do it before Felix in Caesarea. So that's what they do. Paul faces Felix, pretty much lays down his defense after the accusations have been brought against him before Felix. Pretty much saying there's no proof of anything that these people are saying. And of course, we know that there is no proof because Paul didn't do any of the things that they said that he did. But there's a little bit of a political matter that's going on here because Felix is, the way I described it is, he's kind of, a catch-22. Maybe you want to say he's caught between a rock and a hard place because he knows that Paul is innocent. And there's nothing that's being presented that deserves him of being imprisoned or executed or anything like that. So there's that, but there's also the whole thing of where if he lets him go, he knows that it's really going to make the Jews angry, and they might cause a big stir and a riot because of that. And Felix, like other rulers in the past, have been warned by Roman authorities, and even particularly from Caesar himself, hey, get your stuff together, because if you've had this kind of problem before, we're going to have to extract you out of there, and in some cases, maybe even worse. And so Felix is caught in that whole thing. So as we've seen in the text before, what we see is that Felix is one who wants to do the Jews a favor. And so basically he just lays out a stall tactic. He says, look, I'm going to call the Roman tribune over here to testify. And when he comes to testify, we'll get to the bottom of this. Pretty much, essentially, is what he said. The only thing is he doesn't do that at all. Instead, he spends 2 years calling the Apostle Paul into his presence. Now, the Apostle Paul is one who takes the opportunity, at least we see from at least one instance, the opportunity when he's summoned by Felix and spends time with Felix, Paul takes the opportunity to talk about the Christian faith. And remember, he talked about faith in Christ and righteousness and self-control and the final judgment. And Felix is alarmed and says, "Okay, go back to your cell." But he continues to call Paul to him, on a continual basis. And the reason why, according to the text, is that he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, to get him out of there. So, as we saw, that's a pretty interesting scenario that you have there, where Felix doesn't want to do anything to rub the Jews the wrong way, but at the right price, he might let Paul go and just risk the whole negative outcry that he might receive from the Jews as a result. So there you see the heart of greed that is revealed in the person of Governor Felix there. But what we learn at the end of chapter 24, and this is what we saw last time, and this is kind of where we left things, was that Paul was in prison for 2 years. Okay, so nothing got done. Claudius Lysias was never summoned, like Felix said that he would do, and so as it says there in verse 27 of chapter 24, it says, "When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison." So, not even as a last act of governance, saying, "Okay, Paul, you're free to go." He's still one who, at that time, and even during the 2 years that is mentioned there, he wants to do the Jews a favor, and he refuses to let Paul go. And he knows. Listen, remember, he knows that Paul is innocent, and that there's nothing, no criminal act, no wrongdoing that Paul has done that justifies him being in prison or under threat of execution. There's nothing. And you're going to see that's a continual theme too, even with when we look at things having to do with Festus and even with King Agrippa a little bit later as well. So, even in the midst of all of this, I'm still amazed at how Paul conducts himself during this whole thing. Here we're talking about 2 years. And 2 years, even a year, even 6 months, time is precious. And that's time that you can't get back. But one of the things that I think that we can learn about the Apostle Paul, and again, I think this all goes back to, what we observed last time, and how Paul takes an opportunity, even in the less ideal circumstances, to preach the gospel to somebody like Felix. I think we're looking at a man like the Apostle Paul and seeing that, okay, even though, things aren't working his way, and even though as far as from a justice perspective goes, it seems to be getting the runaround, Paul's main concern here, and this is what comes out at the text. We're not even reading about an Apostle Paul who complains about anything, who is trying to say, okay, what's going on with this whole thing. He had plenty of opportunity to do that every time Felix called him over. And who knows, maybe he did, and the text just doesn't say. But what the text highlights here is a man who takes the opportunity face to face with somebody like Felix. And this is just him and Felix, this isn't a court, proceeding or anything like that. It's just a meeting with Felix. And so Paul has this opportunity, and he takes the opportunity to talk about the Christian faith, essentially just preaching the gospel to this guy. And knowing the Apostle Paul, I wouldn't be surprised, and I think I mentioned this last time too, I wouldn't be surprised if we're dealing with somebody who, no matter how long he's behind bars, the more he's summoned, the more he has this, in his mind, he sees, okay, this is another opportunity for me to speak more about the Christian faith. Now, again, the text doesn't say that, so that's just speculation. But I'm just saying I wouldn't be surprised, knowing the Apostle Paul, if that was what was on his mind. And if that was what was on his mind, then we wouldn't be surprised that his number one thing on his mind isn't a complaining spirit of, okay, why is this whole thing proceeding very slowly? What's the deal here? If that's the case, I think that's true. That's truly amazing here. And when we're talking about, at the end of the day, when we look at the whole status of this whole thing, we have 2 years that have gone by where you have a man in captivity when he doesn't deserve to be there, for 2 years, the 2 years that he can't get back. I mean, you just imagine, somebody like the Apostle Paul saying, I could go here, I could go here, I could go there and preach the gospel. I can do all sorts of things. No, 2 years in captivity, not able to go anywhere. And yet he still finds a way. He still finds a way to be an effective instrument for the Lord in preaching the gospel. And so I think that's amazing. So that's where we are. That's where we left off. And so when we get into chapter 25, we get into the whole thing of Paul becoming before Governor Felix. Now, let me just read a handful of verses here, and then we'll make some observations here. So we're starting chapter 25, starting in verse 1, and it says, Now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea, and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So, said he, let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him. Okay. Now, here's the interesting thing that I find so amazing here about what I just read here. 2 years have passed. Okay. Now, you think with the passage of time, you would think that with the passage of time, hostilities would cool, that maybe people would forget, what's going on here with the Apostle Paul. He's not out and about. He's not a free man. He's still in captivity. You would think that for 2 years he's in that state, and you would think that perhaps that would satisfy Paul's Jewish enemies, and that they would just leave the case as it is. But that's not what we see here, okay? 2 years have passed, and they're still on the Apostle Paul's case. Now, I think, after I don't think that they've been active in trying to do Paul in within the 2 years that he was locked up, and he kept being summoned by Felix. I think that after the 2 years, and then after Felix is dethroned from his governor's position, and Festus is put in his place. I almost said Festivus there. I caught myself. And after Festus was put in there, I think what you have here are the unbelieving Jews who see an opportunity to pick up where they left off. Because I think maybe even they had this understanding that they're not going to get very far with Felix. I mean, and from their minds, they're not satisfied with just Paul being in prison and locked away. They want to go further than this. Now, you might ask the question, well, why would they want to go further than this? The guy's not going out anywhere. He's behind bars, essentially. So what's the beef that they have with him? Well, I would say that, or speculate anyway, that Paul, because we know how Paul is a big mouth, and I'm saying this in the strictest positive way, how Paul is a big mouth as it relates to the gospel. And we see that he takes an opportunity to speak with Felix. No doubt, he's probably speaking the same thing to other people within the Praetorium Palace there. And so, these other Jews in Jerusalem might be hearing all that's going on from there and not liking what they hear. And so they're still like, okay, we still have to do something. And so with fresh meat, with a new person in town, with a rookie in Festus, with a change of rulership there as far as procurator of the Judean area, I would imagine that what they're saying is, okay, now is our time, now is our chance to do this here. So it says that after 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. Now Paul is in Caesarea; he's locked up in Caesarea, but Festus goes to Jerusalem, And it's there and it says there in verse 2 that the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul. So they've cooked up this whole thing that he summoned him, Paul, to Jerusalem. And here's the reason: because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. So the same strategy here, if you remember, this is a strategy that was laid out in chapter 23, except it wasn't the chief priests and people in the council who came up with the idea. You just had these regular men, and there were 40 of them, who put themselves under an oath not to eat or drink anything until they had done away with Paul. And so they had this plan of ambush and stuff like that, and they approached the council and said, hey, can you summon him to you? And when he goes from the barracks to the council, we're going to ambush him and we're going to kill him. I mean, that's basically what they have. 40 conspirators who laid out this idea and put themselves under an oath. So this was a very serious thing, which, by the way, I mean, I wonder what happened with these guys. We're talking about something 2 years later. They haven't fulfilled their oath yet because Paul is still alive. You would imagine that if they take their oath seriously and stick to it, then you're dealing with people who are dead now, starvation, because, again, 2 years have passed. Either that or they get so hungry they can't stick with it. And so they say, okay, well, we're just going to have to eat something and break our oath, which in Jewish law is a serious thing. So I don't know. We don't have to analyze that or speculate on that or anything, but I just wonder in my head, whatever happened with those guys. But here in chapter 25, we see that this is the council's idea. And there's nothing new under the sun. This is another plot, same strategy, different day, different year, different ruler, so they're just planning. They're planning on ambushing Paul on the way, and hoping to get him killed. But here again, we see the invisible hand of God just kind of working things out. We talked about that when we looked at this whole thing in chapter 23, and I think that you see the same thing here in chapter 25. God is protecting Paul, and by golly, God is going to get his purposes accomplished. Nobody, no Jewish council, no Roman guards or anything like that is going to stand in his way of getting accomplished what he plans on getting accomplished, which is getting Paul to Rome so that Paul can testify about Christ there. That's what Christ himself had informed Paul of doing in chapter 23, back in verse 11, where Christ appeared to Paul and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." So God is going to get him there, okay? And so what we see here is that Festus doesn't agree to this. In verse 4, Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly. And so pretty much as I read there in verse 5 also, he says, if you're going to bring a case against him, come with me to Caesarea, face him there, let's take care of it there, pretty much. So the plan to ambush is not going to come to fruition because this is what Festus has declared. It's that this is the way that we're going to do things. So starting in verse 6, it says, after he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. Verse 7, when he arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. So again, there again is another recurring theme that we're seeing here. Okay, now I mean it's as it says here, many and serious charges. So there were serious charges, and they had a whole bunch of them. Now, here's the thing, because what we've looked at before, when it all started out, when they first grabbed a hold of Paul in Jerusalem, they had said that he speaks against the Jewish people, he speaks against the holy place, and he speaks against the law of Moses. I mean, that's pretty much what they had against him. when he stood before Felix in chapter 24, they had accused him of one who stirs up riots. I guess you can chalk that up to being seditious, which gives you this understanding that he's one who wants to stir people up to go against the Romans. I think is what they were trying to convey there, which obviously is not true. And Paul lays out his defense there. We talked about that. A couple weeks ago. That he was a leader of a heretic group, a sect of the Nazarenes. We talked about that. And that he tried to profane the temple. Okay, so when we get here to chapter 25, and I don't know this because the text doesn't give specifics as to what his Jewish enemies were saying, just as far as the accusations go. It could have been a variation of the same accusations that were thrown out, but you get the sense, at least I get the sense maybe that in those 2 years they thought of more things to accuse Paul of doing, because it says there that they accused him that they, let's see, where does it say here? Bringing many and serious charges against him. So there were many now. What we looked at before is just a few, a handful. Now Luke is saying that they brought many charges against him and that they were serious. Okay, so it seems like the charges that they're throwing against him have grown. Okay, and that these are serious charges. Now, whether serious from a Roman perspective, and that's what they're trying to do, or serious in the minds of the Jews, it's just as far as how it relates to the Jewish religion. I mean, you can speculate. I would say probably towards the Jewish mind, because from the Roman perspective, they're hearing everything that's going on and what they're saying about Paul, and they're saying, we see nothing wrong with this guy. There's nothing that they're presenting that where we would say that this Paul guy is deserving of death or imprisonment or anything like that. But whatever the case, they're throwing these serious charges against Paul. But again, the thing that you see there at the very end of verse 7, that's the reoccurring theme, is that these were charges against him that they could not prove. And that's what Paul had said even before in chapter 24. It says, look, they can't even prove all of this. They can't prove anything. Now, here's the thing, because again, you go back to the whole thing. It says they say that these are serious charges against him. I just kind of imagine, like, if you look at what this would look like in the 21st century, maybe even outside of the religious realm, if somebody's bringing up serious charges against somebody, that would be like somebody without any proof, without any backup information, or without any witnesses or anything like that, accusing somebody of molesting a child. I mean, if you want to talk about something that people really consider as serious, I mean, so serious that even in prison, even inmates will do a number on somebody if they find out that they're a child molester, right? Accusing somebody of having molested a child or children, a serial pedophile. And there's no proof, there's no charges, even if it's shown that it's not true, or that there's no proof against him. You get the word about that circulating around, that really does damage to that person's reputation. That's a serious thing. And so obviously, the charge of pedophilia and what's going on in chapter 25, we're not dealing with the same thing. All I'm saying is that if we're talking about people who are bringing up serious charges, we see that we have people who have no qualms of bringing serious charges against the Apostle Paul, and they don't even seem to mind that they can't prove any of these things. Now, you'd think that 2 years ago, it's laid out before Felix that they can't prove anything. But yet, that sort of status still holds true 2 years later, and it's like without skipping a beat, they're willing to bring charges against Paul, even though they have no proof of anything. Amazing, 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 amazing. And so that's what you have going on here. So in verse 8, as we pick up, it says, Paul argued in his defense neither against against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. Now, interestingly, that's the only thing that we hear from the Apostle Paul as far as this defense. And I think that that's just a summary of what Paul's defense may have been. Luke doesn't provide us with another long discourse of what Paul may have said in his defense to Festus. Okay, it's just summed up there in that verse, in verse 8. Where we will get a longer discourse when he speaks to Agrippa. And again, that has more to do with him giving his testimony to Agrippa as it relates to the case that's laid out before them. But here, as far as him being before Festus, he says neither against the law of the Jews, which the Romans wouldn't have cared about anyway. But he says but against the law of the Jews, neither against the law of the Jews nor against the temple. And remember, what they had said is that he had tried to defile the temple, and Paul laid out his defense there, saying, when they came to the temple, they saw me at the temple, they saw me as a purified human being. So neither against the law of the Jews nor against the temple, and this would be the important thing, at least from the eyes of the Roman Gentiles here, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. Now, if he had committed offense against Caesar, then yes, that would definitely be something that would perk up the ears of people like Festus and anybody else who's involved in these proceedings. So, and again, you could go back to one of the things that they said back in chapter 24 is that he stirs up riots, which would have been a concern to the Romans, and so maybe that's still something that they're saying in the proceedings before Festus. And so Paul is saying none of this is true. So as you continue in verse 9, it says, but Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor. Oh my goodness. So the politics of this whole matter still sticks. And you get the sense that Festus knows that nothing is wrong with Paul. But you still have Festus, who from political motivations and wanting to do the Jews a favor, probably with the same motives that Felix had of not carrying through and doing the right thing, because if he let him go, saying I don't see anything wrong with him, might get a lot of pushback from the Jews, and a lot of disturbance, a lot of public disturbance. And again, that's just something that the higher ups and even Caesar himself are not a big fan of. And if those things happen, and especially on a regular basis, Caesar's going to look down and say, hey, what is the deal? What's going on with this? So Festus knows. I mean, Festus is a newbie here, but he knows the deal here, and he knows what he's up against, and he knows that any wrong move and the Jews are really going to be on him. And so he's in the position, just like Felix, where he wants to do the Jews a favor. And so how does he extend this favor to the Jews? Still in verse 9, he said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? Now notice, he's suggesting this whole thing of a change of venue, right? We'll go from here and we'll go to Jerusalem, and you'll still present the case before me. That's what it's saying there. And there be tried on these charges before me. So you get the sense that Festus is still, the central person in the proceedings and this being tried before him. But I think where the favor comes in is that, with the Jews in Caesarea, you just have a representative group of people who are there in Caesarea bringing charges against Paul before Festus. You bring him back to Jerusalem. I mean, things are still in the hands of Festus, but you also have an opportunity where you have more accusers in that area who are able to speak out against the Apostle Paul. So really, he's giving it's almost as if he's giving advantage to the Jews by changing the venue from Caesarea to Jerusalem, and maybe in some way trying to find some excuse to say, oh, okay, with this more information, now that we hear from more Jews of this area, we'll keep you in prison or, whatever. But I think the idea, at the very least, is to bring Paul back to Jerusalem so that the Jews have home court advantage, if you will, if you want to use that term. So Festus presents this idea to Paul. Hey, is this what you want to do? And so in verse 10, it says, but Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. And, keep in mind, as we read these verses here, remember something. Remember that Paul is a Roman citizen, and he's about to exercise the rights of a Roman citizen here. But even as a Roman citizen, he recognizes that he is right where he needs to be. Okay? If this is something that is being brought before the Roman authorities, and at the urging of things to be brought before the Roman authorities, and particularly with Festus here, Paul is essentially saying, look, there's no need for me to go back to Jerusalem, and Paul sees right through what's happening here, and he understands the advantage that the Jews are going to have if they go from Caesarea to Jerusalem, and so he says, look, I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be. Parentheses, because I am a Roman citizen, I guess is another thing that you can put in there if you want to understand the mindset of where Paul is coming from here. And he says, to the Jews I have done no wrong, which we've seen that that's the case. We don't need to go through that again. But he says, but to the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. So see, he points out to Festus, he said, look, Festus, I know that you know what the whole deal is. And you know very well that I haven't done anything against the Jews. I haven't done anything against the law or anything like that. You know what the real deal is. Okay. So he continues in verse 11. He says, if then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, and if you want to put parentheses, according to the Roman law, because he pretty much says, you know that I haven't done anything against the Jews. Now look, if I'm a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, he continues in verse 11, I do not seek to escape death. Okay? So he's saying, look, let's examine things according to what is actually stipulated in the law. And if it turns out that I've done something wrong and I've broken the law that's deserving of death, look, I'm not going to fight you. I'm not going to fight you, there wouldn't be any need for Paul to be afraid, because I think Paul knows that he didn't do anything wrong or didn't do anything to break Roman law. And even if he did, and even if it was inadvertent and they kill him, he knows that he's going to be with his Lord, right? I mean, I think we're dealing with something where Paul is not really afraid to do this. Small side note here. I mean, in case if you want to have something to chew on or to consider on, it seems here that Paul has no qualms with capital punishment, with the death penalty. Now, if because he seems to give approval of the idea that if you do something against the law that's deserving of death, then that should be brought up on somebody. And he includes himself, and he says, I'm not even going to escape death. So, if we're talking about the whole thing of what does the Bible say about capital punishment, this isn't the only place where you can make an argument for it. But here, I mean, that's just a side note, has nothing, we don't need to talk about it or anything, but just a side note, a little thought that came to my head when I was looking at this passage earlier, and it's saying, like, what's the whole deal with capital punishment, with the death penalty? Is that right or wrong? Paul doesn't seem to have a problem with it here. But anyway, that's not the main focus of what we want to talk about here. But still in verse 11, in the middle of verse 11, he says, but if there is nothing wrong, if there is nothing to these charges against me, no one can give me up to them, to the Jews. No one can give me up to them. Because listen, if we're dealing now with, he says, I haven't done anything against the Jews. The only thing that we can examine is anything that I've done against Roman law. And if I've done anything against Roman law that deserves death, then bring it to me, okay? I won't try and escape it. But if there's nothing to these charges against me, you can't hand me over to the Jews, because there's nothing that I've done wrong to the Jews, and the Jews can't exercise any authority over me or any sort of punishment of anything that I may have done against Roman law. So you can't hand me back to them. So what does he do? Last part of verse 11, I appeal to Caesar, okay? Which means that by doing that, Paul has stamped his ticket to Rome. Now, whether Paul had in mind what the Lord Jesus had said to him before about how he will testify to him in Rome, whether he had that in mind or not, I mean, you can't really tell. But here we have right here, just based on the circumstances, where Paul really doesn't have any more choice in the matter, just from a legal perspective, where he says, I appeal to Caesar. And so in this way, we see that this is the way that Paul is going to get from where he is to Rome. Okay, that's how it all unfolds. So in verse 12, it says, then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. So, the ticket is stamped, the situation is sealed. Okay, and so all the proceedings, are stopped now. And that's how it worked. If anybody was a Roman citizen in any sort of court situation, it says, I appeal to Caesar, the proceedings stop, and they say, okay, you'll go to Caesar, and then they'll be taken to Rome to present their case before Caesar. Okay, and so that's how that works. Now, what we see here with Paul, with Agrippa in chapter 26, isn't part of a court proceeding. This isn't that's not part of a trial, and we're not going to get to that this time. But just to tell you what's going on, I mean, this is more along the lines of trying to figure out what to write as far as what the charges are against Paul, so that they can present that to Caesar, because it's not a good idea to send him to Caesar without anything, to write down. And that's the dilemma that Festus is under, and we'll see that here in the passage here, is that I don't know what to write. I mean, just as far as, the charges that are against this man, that's his dilemma. And so what we're going to see later, when he's before Agrippa, is pretty much, I guess, if you want to call it anything, I guess maybe you can call it maybe along the same lines as a grand jury hearing. But I mean, even there, I don't know, maybe. But so in verse 13 and following, it says, now when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. So I would imagine that this is a whole thing where Agrippa comes to visit Festus, to visit him after he acquires this new governorship in the area of Judea. Agrippa here is I think I may have mentioned this before last time, just as far as who we're going to be dealing with here. But with this guy Agrippa, this is Herod Agrippa II. Okay, now we've already had dealings with his father, King Herod Agrippa I. He's not called Agrippa I. He's just called, if I remember correctly, he's just called Herod in Acts chapter 12. Which historically that would have been Agrippa I. And Agrippa I is the one who had James, the brother of John, beheaded and had put Peter in prison. That's that guy. And then the guy who didn't give glory to God when everybody was shouting that he has the voice of a god. And so God struck him down and he died. That's King Agrippa I. And so here with what we have here with Agrippa, this is Agrippa II, from what we understand historically. And it says, and Bernice. Now Bernice was Agrippa II's sister. And so here's the thing, though, because the people you might look at that and think that Bernice is Agrippa's wife, and she's not necessarily, but. And again, from historical sources, there had been suspicions, and maybe not even suspicions. Maybe it was cold hard fact that there was incestuous relations going on between Agrippa II and Bernice, who was Agrippa's the second sister, and therefore a daughter of King Agrippa I. Now, the interesting thing is that Bernice is the sister of Drusilla, and remember, Drusilla was the wife of Felix. We were introduced to Drusilla last time, so you have a whole family circle going on there. Bernice, by the way, her history is kind of a little bit messy too. I mean, we're talking about her with Agrippa II and incestuous relationships and things like that going on. She'd previously, before speaking to Agrippa, had been married to. I think she had been married to. If not, then it was just a illicit sexual relationship outside of marriage. Either way, it's bad, with her uncle, and had produced 2 children by her uncle. So we're dealing with a mess here, just as far as that goes. But that's who we have here. We have Agrippa II and his sister Bernice, and they arrive at Caesarea and greeted Festus. Now, verse 14, it says, and as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man left prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him." So here's the thing. So they come before Festus and say, "Hey, can you lay sentence on him?" That's just like somebody coming before a judge and saying, "Hey, can you charge this guy and sentence him to this, and this," without any sort of proceedings happening in front of that particular judge. And so in verse 16, he says, "I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charges laid against him," which makes sense. "So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accuser stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I supposed." So I guess you kind of get the idea that they were saying certain things, and then you get to the trial here, and then it's like, wow, this isn't even what I expected. They're throwing out these things that in their mind are pretty serious, but it's not. This isn't what I expected. It caught him totally by surprise here. Let's see. I made no delay to verse 19. "Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive." Now, if anything, with this, of course, we know, and we've mentioned before, that anything regarding all of this that they're saying of what they have against Paul as it relates to their religion or Paul's thoughts on this Jesus guy, they don't care about that, from a legal perspective. If anything, they would look at this whole thing of this Jesus guy who's dead and now alive. They would kind of maybe snicker at it and think that it's ridiculous because they don't believe in that whole thing of resurrection from the dead and everything. But certainly not anything to punish this guy over. And you see here kind of the lack of knowledge that Festus has about these sorts of things. Felix had somewhat of an accurate knowledge. Of course, Paul explained to him more as he shared the Christian faith with him about the whole thing of the gospel. But even before then, Felix had an accurate knowledge of the way. Here, you kind of get the sense that there's things that he doesn't understand, or perhaps that he's just started to learn this for the first time. Saying that. And about a certain Jesus, this guy, who knows who this guy is, who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Now, verse 20, "Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and to be tried there regarding them." Now, Luke lets us in on the fact that what Festus was really trying to do was trying to do the Jews a favor, and we explained all that a few minutes ago. But of course, he can't really just lay that out to Agrippa. So he says, "Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem to be tried there regarding them." And then verse 21, "But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I can send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, 'I would like to hear the man myself.' 'Tomorrow,' said he, 'you will hear him.'" So here again, we're being set up for another. I don't know what the right word, confrontation. Although it's not really a confrontation. I'm at a loss for words. So that's the best I can come up with. Again, this is what we're going to be seeing here in future verses is not a trial, and we'll see that here as we get to the end of chapter 25 here. And so as we continue on in verse 23, it says, "So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp This is a whole big production that went on as they came into the gathering there, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. Then at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in, and Festus said, "King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish you have seen this man about whom the whole Jewish people petition me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer." Again, and you're familiar with that if you've been with us for a while. That's the continual thing that they want to see. We want to see this guy dead. Verse 25, but I found that he had done nothing deserving death. And as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. But, verse 26, and here's the dilemma that he's in, but I have nothing definite to write to my lord about him. Therefore, I have brought him before you all, especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him. So, and here's what I would say, just kind of to add a little bit of commentary in there. He's saying, for it seems unreasonable in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him, and then maybe in parentheses, that makes sense. Because as we see in chapter 25 there, and as we've seen, they have brought charges against Paul. But you get the sense that with Festus, it's just like, so I don't get what your beef is. Much of what your beef is things having to do with your own Jewish thing, okay? And so Festus is in a position where he's saying, like, look, I certainly can't take that to Caesar because Caesar's not going to care. So if Paul appeals to Caesar, I have to write something, but I don't know what that something is because what he's actually done deserving of death hasn't been articulated sufficiently. Now, this is Paul's wish. Paul's wish is to go to Rome, to appeal to Caesar and to appear before him. So now he's like, well, I gotta write something. And so here you have Agrippa who says, I want to hear about what's going on here. And so not only with Agrippa, but prominent men in the city, military tribunes and everything, Paul is going to be making his case before them. But he's going to be Paul's going to be directing his words towards Agrippa himself. And the idea is, I think the idea from Festus's perspective is that, hey, can you give me some opinion after hearing this guy on what I need to write down, to Caesar so that he knows what he's dealing with. And so that's the idea behind the proceedings that we're going to see in chapter 26, which we're going to start to look at next time. And so what we're going to see with Paul presenting what he does, we're going to be exposed to his testimony. And we've heard his testimony before. We've seen his story back in chapter 9. We examined again his testimony, some of his testimony back in chapter 22. We're going to see it again here in chapter 26. We're probably not going to go into a whole bunch of details since we've visited this sort of thing before, but there are certain things within his testimony that are worth noting that we're going to talk about next time. So we'll leave it there for now. So we're just continuing on in this dramatic story that keeps unfolding here. And I think I've mentioned before just kind of the challenge of doing these strings of podcast episodes and leaving things where there doesn't seem to be any sort of apparent resolution yet. So I'd ask you just to stay with me on this as we continue to unfold these things. And just even with some of the observations that we can make in this here. One thing that I think that we continually see is that God's hand is at work in all of this. Even though it's not explicitly stated in the text, you get this sense, you get this idea that God is in the midst of everything. And even when we see how Paul is protected from another ambush, it's not like God appears to Festus and says, hey, they're gonna ambush Paul If you bring them from Caesarea to Jerusalem, don't let them do this. I mean, it's just along the normal course of things. God is working things according to his sovereignty and through his providence to protect Paul and to continue to have him put in a position where he's able to explain himself, defend himself, and not only defend himself, but in Paul's mind, it's more than that, because he finds opportunities to preach the gospel. We see that with again, like we said before, we see that with Felix, in his interaction with Felix, and we're going to see his attempt to do that with Festus. Now, Festus is going to see right through it and says, "You think you're really going to be able to turn me into a Christian?" So a very interesting exchange that's going to happen. I don't know if we're going to get to that part next time, or if we're going to have to see that in a couple of weeks. It depends on how we divvy up chapter 26. Whether we're able to get through it all in one time or if we have to split it up. But so anyway, stay tuned for that, because I think that's going to be an interesting exchange, and it's going to be interesting just to kind of pick that apart a little bit and see what we see just as it relates to that. But whatever the case, what we see is somebody who, in the midst of his speaking to somebody in higher authority, is taking that opportunity to try and make Christ known to somebody who doesn't know him. So there you see the single-minded purpose of Paul, where the opportunity to preach the gospel to somebody never escapes him. And so he takes that opportunity there as well. So it's going to be interesting thing to see. Okay, so like I said, we'll leave it there. If you like this show and you're coming up on Loving the Scriptures for the first time, and if you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on iTunes, also on Google Play. You can also check out Loving the Scriptures on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. All right, friends, I've enjoyed my time with you as always. Hope you join us back here next time as we continue to unfold this drama that's happening with the Apostle Paul as we near the end of the book of Acts. My name is Steve Gill, and I hope you have a good week. Bye now.